Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast episode. I wanted to do this particular podcast episode a little different than some of the normal topics, but I was reflecting recently on some of the books that have impacted me the most and why they were impactful. And so I wanted to do just a podcast episode and share some of these books with you and why they were meaningful to me, or how they changed my leadership journey or my life's journey. Or I mean, really, I these few books that I'm going to share really impacted the course of my journey in some way. And when I reflected on that, I thought, man, I think anytime we read a nonfiction book that makes you think, number one, what you get out of it is different based on your current level of awareness. And number two, if your current level of awareness changes, you might get something different out of it. It's sort of like when you go back, even though you've read the Bible, you go back and you read it again, but you're at a different place in your life and your life's journey. And so different verses mean different things to you or resonate with you in a different way. I think it's the same way with personal growth / leadership books. Even if you've read them before, it's worth going back and reading some of the great books again, because if they provoke thought in you the first time, but now you're at a different level of awareness, it might provoke a different thought. And when you go back and read it again. So, wanted to just reflect on that and then share some of the books again that have impacted me the most. So these are not necessarily in order of importance or how much they impacted me, but I put them sort of in order of when I came across them in my personal leadership and growth journey. So first and foremost, one of the books that really impacted me and my level of awareness, books that changed my life, right? One of the first ones that comes to mind is Leadership Gold by John Maxwell, for two reasons. Number one, this was one of the very first leadership books that I purchased for myself. Like, I spent my own money to purchase, and it represented a huge step for me because at the time, I think I paid I don't know, 30 something dollars for that book. I was at an event and John Maxwell was being simulcast. So he was speaking at the event via, a simulcast experience. So everyone there with me at the event, we kind of gathered around. I think it was a church auditorium, and then they played up on screen different speakers. So it was simulcast live from a different location, but we were watching it on screen. And John Maxwell was one of the speakers there. And then, of course, they had some books for sale. After you got done being inspired by the speakers, you could go get some of their books. And Leadership Gold was one of the first leadership books that I ever invested in myself. At the time, that was a lot of money. I mean, it still is a lot of money, but it was a lot of money back then, but it also represented a different way that I was investing in myself. For the first time, I was actually investing money in my personal growth. And I really would not have articulated that at the time. In fact, it was one of those things, it was like, I'm about to spend this money and I hope the book is good, but I don't really know what I'm going to get out of it. Now, these days, I might buy a personal growth or leadership book, and I do have an expectation of what I'm going to get out of it, at least a few nuggets. But at the time, I really didn't know what I was going to get out of it. It was just something that said, invest in yourself and your development by taking that next step. Right now, I'm not just attending the event and hearing the speaker, I'm actually reading and learning from the speaker. So Leadership Gold. So that's the first and foremost reason that this book impacted me and changed my life in the course of my journey in some way. But the second reason that this book impacted me was what I call the marble story. And if you've never read Leadership Gold by John Maxwell, it has a parable in there. And the parable is written by Jeffrey Davis. And I won't read you the whole parable, but basically paraphrasing it, the parable goes into the story of someone who is listening to the radio and they hear an older gentleman talking about a jar of marbles. And so the person listening to the radio stops and listens to the speaker, and the speaker goes into calculating that the average person lives about 75 years. Some live a little more, some a little less, but on average, let's say the average lifespan is 75 years. So the story continues that the person on the airwaves, on the radio, goes into talk about multiplying 75 years times 52 weeks, and that gives you 3,900, which is the number of Saturdays that the average person has in their entire lifetime. And then the story continues to say, you know what? It took me until I was 55 years old to think about this. And by that time, I had lived through 2,800 of my Saturdays. So I got to thinking, I probably only had about 1,000 Saturdays left. So I went to the toy store and bought every single marble that they had, and I ended up having to visit 3 different toy stores in order to get 1,000 marbles. But I put all of these marbles in a big clear plastic container, and every Saturday I take one marble out and I throw it away. And the speaker goes on to share in the parable, I found that watching the marbles diminish, I focused more on the really important things in life, because there's nothing like watching your time on earth run out to help you get your priorities straight. So the story continues, and the speaker finishes up with, today, I took the very last marble out and I threw it away. And I figure if I make it until next Saturday, I've been given a little extra time. And the one thing we can all use is a little extra time. And the parable wraps up with whoever is listening in the parable to the story, the speaker on the airwaves, realizing that their personal priorities were not in the right place. And so they just shift their perspective in the parable on what's most important in how I spend my Saturday. And that story really touched me. I have shared it many times when I'm speaking, and it's one of those stories I almost cannot share without just getting emotional, because it just impacts me in such a way to realize life is short and it's precious, and a lot of times I think we take it for granted. And so we don't spend our free time on the most important things in our life, or the most important people in our life. And so after I read that story, I didn't get 1,000, but I did get a little jar and a few marbles. And I keep that here in my office on, sort of my bookshelf where I keep, meaningful things. Programs from different events where I might have spoken at, or gifts that someone gave me after speaking at an event, or something that, is a souvenir or a memento for myself. And so I keep that little jar of little marbles there. Again, I don't have 1,000 of them, and I don't throw one away every Saturday, but just keeping that jar of marbles as a reminder for spending time with the most important things and priorities in my life. And that's relationships. That's people for me. So anyway, love that story. And again, if you've never read that book, The Leadership Gold by John Maxwell has some great leadership lessons in it. Absolutely no doubt. But what I took away most was the marble story. So love that. The second book that really impacted the course of my journey was The 5 Levels of Leadership, again by John Maxwell. And I love, number one, I love Maxwell's books because they are full of great stories and full of great, leadership lessons or personal growth lessons. And I think one reason that the first 2 books that have had the most impact in my journey are, aside from the Bible, are by John Maxwell, because in the early days when I was first reading and learning and growing in my leadership journey, he was the author that I knew had some really great content. And so I was by nature reading a lot of his books in the early days. But The 5 Levels of Leadership by John Maxwell really breaks down he talks about leadership as influence, and the 5 levels of leadership talks about the different levels of leadership and how we can be intentional about developing those. And that one really changed the course of my leadership journey, because Maxwell talks about your authority is the lowest level of leadership. And you have to be intentional about building relationships in order to lead and influence people without your position of authority. And that really helped me grow and be intentional about building relationships with those people that I want to influence. And I could not have articulated why that was important until I read his book. So, phenomenal leadership book. And of course, there are many, many, many great leadership books out there. But that one, this podcast, I'm really just sharing the ones that, I can look back and say, I did something different, or I became someone different after reading this book. And that's, of course, maybe different for everybody. I'm not suggesting that you need to run out and buy all of these books specifically, but sharing how they impacted me. So the third book that really changed my perspective was Leadership and Self-Deception. And this is put out by the Arbinger Institute. It's a short read. It's a parable. So it's a little bit of a fictional story woven around the principles in the book. But it really talks about our paradigm of seeing people as people instead of seeing people as objects. And so after reading this book, it changed how I interacted with people throughout my day in random encounters. So for example, I now am more intentional about connecting with the person who is ringing my groceries up at the grocery store. Whereas before, I might just be, standing in line at the grocery store and the person rings up my groceries, and you might exchange the most basic, "Hey, how are you?" But, I had that perspective of focused on self, right? Just get through the grocery line as quickly as possible. And after reading Leadership and Self-Deception, I now am intentional about connecting with that person who is ringing up my groceries and, hey, really, how are you? I want to know their name. I want to greet them by name and use that, because that is a person and they matter. And how I treat them matters. And so this book really touched me in that perspective of course, we want to be, I think all of us would say we are, for the most part, intentional about the relationships that are important to us. Sure, we take time to ask our spouse. I hope we take time to ask our spouse, "Hey, how are you? How are you really?" But a lot of us, I know I didn't have the perspective that every encounter I have with somebody matters. How I treat that server at a restaurant, how I treat the clerk at the post office, right? Be intentional about connecting with those people, because they are people. And it's amazing when you start to do this, how much more effective you become at intentionally building relationships in all dimensions of your life. So I love Leadership and Self-Deception because it's just such a powerful read. Definitely highly, highly, highly recommend that book for leaders and for just people. It will change how you interact. And number 4, and the last one that I really want to talk about today, is The 5 Levels of Attachment by Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. And this book, I've done a podcast episode on. I've done a whole podcast episode on the 5 levels of attachment in the past. And because it was one of those books that made me think differently about the attachments that I had in my life. And so this book really breaks down how attachments become attachments to begin with in ourself, and how that impacts us as we go throughout the day. And it made me realize that some of our attachments are not always healthy. And so it challenged me to think about that and let go of some of the attachments that were not really serving me well, and, moving to a lesser level of attachment to things that were not important. And I think this is really helpful because we can all get too attached to some of the wrong things. But it's important to realize what are the attachments that we have in terms of our identity and our relationship with ourself. And when that changes, right, it's increasing that level of self-awareness, then it empowers us to grow in healthy ways. It empowers us to be intentional about creating our identity for ourselves based on our values, instead of just having an identity that is created by default through circumstances and environment. It really helps us be intentional about creating our own identity based on what's most important to us and where we want to go. And it gives you permission to let go of those levels of attachment to things that are not serving you. And the 5 Levels of Attachment was one of those books. It's a small book, but I had to read it 2 or 3 times before I really grasped the depth of this concept. And so the first time I read it, I got a little bit out of it. The second time and the third time that I read it, I got even more. So all that to share with you, if you haven't read the book, number one, it's great. It's very impactful. There are definitely a couple of things or concepts in there that particularly the first time I read it, I wasn't sure that I understood it or that I could even agree with it. But like anything, I can learn, even if I'm not in total agreement with the author in everything that they want to share, I can learn and get a great concept or a great principle or a great quote out of just about any good personal growth and leadership book. And this was, again, very impactful personal growth book for me. So there you have it. The top 4 books that I look back and I can say, these books changed my life and my leadership journey in some way. And again, your list is different than my list, and some of that is subjective based on where we are in our own journey. But I wanted to do a little bit of an episode sharing why these books were impactful. And if you have not read any of these or all of these books, I definitely highly recommend that you go get them. You can find them. They're all available on Amazon, of course. But, speaking of that, you can get used copies of books from Amazon. So if you're not investing or not able to invest a whole lot of money to buy brand new copies, most of the time you can pick up a used copy for much, much cheaper. So again, investing in yourself and your growth, and that will reap benefits over time. Until next time.